G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how to fix an anteriorly tilted pelvis. So we're going to go through 3 exercises towards the end of the video that hopefully help you achieve that. Before we get to those exercises, I want to talk about 3 other really important concepts that will help make those exercises more effective. The first thing that we're going to talk about basically is why we should even care whether our pelvis is anteriorly tilted in the first place. The second one is I want to talk about the hidden cause of an anteriorly tilted pelvis, or at least the hidden cause of some of the things that we're going to try and address with these exercises, because as we try and promote on this channel, it's not good enough just to address some of the symptoms and the dysfunction with exercises. We also have to make sure we're working hard at fixing the cause of that dysfunction if we want to get rid of this anteriorly tilted pelvis in the first place. And then the third additional concept I want to go through is I want to show you how to self-assess whether you have an anteriorly tilted pelvis, just so that you've got a really broad understanding of what's going on, again, to give ourselves the best chance to fix this going forwards. So before we get to this information, let me know down in the comments below if you have any certain tricks or any certain tips or ideas around an anteriorly tilted pelvis that you find are really helpful. I want to make sure this video captures as many ideas as possible. Beyond what I'm finding clinically, I'm always open to new ideas. I'm always open to trying new things to help my patients get better. And if you have any sort of pearls of wisdom, please let me know down in the comments. I would greatly appreciate that. So, getting into the video, the first thing that I basically think we need to talk about here, and we'll go through these concepts quickly, is why we should even care about whether your pelvis is tilted forwards or not. So for those who don't know, obviously, an anteriorly tilted pelvis is essentially a pelvis that's dumping forwards. So if you can imagine your pelvis is very similar to a bowl, if we're dumping that pelvic bowl forwards, we're anteriorly tilting that pelvis. And the reason why this is just so important is that your pelvis is obviously physically and literally connected to a bunch of structures above and below. They're attached to that pelvis, and also within the pelvis we have a lot of musculoskeletal tissue, a lot of fascia. We have a lot of organs and things like that that rely on the pelvis to function really well, for them to function really well. So if we take the low back, for example, if your pelvis is anteriorly tilted forwards and those hip bones at the front are sort of pointing downwards, that can create a lot of dysfunction of the lower back. And what we see basically is if you have an anteriorly tilted pelvis, those low back joints, those lumbar spine joints can be sort of jammed up a lot more or loaded up in a way that they're not designed for over time. And clinically, I see there's a big link there between arthritic joints, maybe some dysfunction at that low back that's caused because that pelvis is deorientated or anteriorly tilted. So if you've got some low back dysfunction, correcting that anterior pelvic tilt can be a really strong foundational thing to take care of to give your back a chance to settle and get better long term. The other really important thing that relates to the position of your pelvis is that your pelvic floor muscles become inhibited if you're tilted forwards too often for too long. And we see an anteriorly tilted pelvis as a really common underlying factor relating to a lot of pelvic floor dysfunction in terms of incontinence, erectile dysfunction potentially, especially with pregnant women when there's a bit more pelvic tilting going on potentially. We can see that these dysfunctions aren't disparate issues, they're all connected in some way. So making sure that we can recognise that an anteriorly tilted pelvis can be a really strong underlying cause of a lot of dysfunction around that, correcting it becomes a lot more important. And it's not as hard to do as it may seem, but we need to make sure that we're nailing the underlying reasons for why it's there in the first place. Now, the other thing that's really important to take away from this is when we're trying to understand why an anteriorly tilted pelvis occurs, we need to have a look at your day-to-day habits, your day-to-day positions and shapes. And as we'll get to in an exercise towards the end of the video, one of the most common reasons why a pelvis tilts forward in the first place is that our hip flexors, or the tissue at the front of the hips, become tight. And obviously when we sit down a lot throughout the day, our hips become prone to becoming stiff and tight at the front. We're always stuck in this 90-90 position, sitting in a chair, sitting on the couch, driving, doing whatever we need to do. And this tissue becomes tight at the front. So when we're up and about and functioning, all of a sudden the tissue at the front can create this drag down on the front of the pelvis, sort of locking it into a more anteriorly tilted position. As I was saying before, when that pelvis is anteriorly tilted, then that pelvic floor doesn't necessarily function as well, the low back doesn't function as well, including core strength and things like that. So when we're trying to reorientate that pelvis and improve how you're going, we need to take a look at your sitting habits. And one of the exercises that we're going to get to is to try and unglue and release those structures at the front of the hip. But if you're then consistently sitting down a lot throughout the day and maybe not standing as much as you could, then there's the potential for these muscles to keep getting tight and this tissue to keep coming back and being restricted and making it hard for you to fix this long term. So again, if we're going to get you to the point where we fix this anterior pelvic tilt forever, obviously we need to undo some of that accrued dysfunction, but we also need to make sure that you're giving that dysfunction a chance to stay away by maybe mitigating that with less sitting or more standing or even just constant stretching potentially. But like I said, we need to make sure we have this broader understanding of why that's there in the first place. If that tissue at the front becomes tight, it's really hard for that pelvis to be in a neutral position. So that's point number 2. Point number 3 that I want to touch on before we get to these exercises is it's really good to have a self-assessment so that you can keep track of how that pelvis is going over time. It's good to have something to do right at the start of all this so that as you're doing these exercises and as the days go on, you can keep self-assessing yourself and see how much better that pelvis is being positioned. And it's a really, really easy thing to do. So one of the things that we want to do, and one of the ways that we can do this, is if you stand up nice and tall with your feet straight, the interesting thing about a pelvis is when you squeeze your glutes, it reorientates your pelvis into a good position. So that relationship between your butt cheek and your pelvis and all the deep gluteal muscles within that, when you squeeze those glutes, it tends to reorientate your pelvis into a better position. So if you just simply stand up, squeeze your butt cheeks, if you feel your pelvis rolls backwards as you do that, that tells you that your pelvis is more naturally anteriorly tilted than it should be. So instead of getting you to squeeze your butt and then walk around with your butt squeezed all the time, you need to make sure that your body can hold that position a lot better. Again, it's going to be reflected in the exercises that we get to. But again, that self-assessment that I want you to keep coming back to just to see how you're going and keep track of how you're progressing is to stand up nice and tall, feet straight, squeeze that butt cheek, and then just witness what happens to your pelvis. In a perfect world, whether you squeeze your butt cheek or not, your pelvis shouldn't change position. It should stay relatively neutral. So keep that in mind as we go through this, and obviously as we go through these exercises, keep coming back to that self-assessment so you can see if it's changing. So they're the 3 main things that I wanted to touch on quickly in terms of why it's important, how it happens, and how to self-assess. And then the important thing to go through here with these 3 exercises is that we need to make sure that you're consistent with them. So the first exercise that we're going to get to is going to try and address probably the most important piece of this dysfunction that I find clinically, that restriction at the front of the hips. Now this can be muscular tightness, excuse me, through hip flexors. It can be fascial tightness. It can be joint capsule stiffness just from being in this position a lot. So there's a number of ways that you can release this. But one of the main ones that I want to touch on is the hip flexor stretch. And I can talk to you about how to modify this to, I guess, depending on what you find is most important for you. But the hip flexor stretch is relatively simple. Now, in order to do this, a great place to start is kneeling on the ground. Now, obviously a lot of people may not feel fantastic with their knee on the ground, so please have something underneath, whether it be a pillow, whether it be a towel, whatever it can be. You can also do this sitting on a chair, where if I switch legs, you can imagine I'm sitting on a chair here, maybe a little bit higher, so that you can just let that knee drop back, so that you can really encourage that stretch. So you don't have to have your knee on the ground if you don't want to. It is more beneficial if you can, and you'll see why in a second. So the way that I like to get people to do this is you need to make sure that you're up nice and tall, belly drawn in a little bit, and all we're doing here is we're going to squeeze your butt cheeks to keep you in a good pelvic position, and we're going to get you to shift your hips forwards past your knee. So we're not doing it in a way where you're going to arch backwards or in a way where you're lunging forwards. We're going to keep your trunk upright and basically push your hips forwards until you feel you get some tightness at the front of that hip. And because we want to make this very specific to you, what you can do here is instead of going straight forwards, you can go in a few different angles and a few different directions just to see exactly where the best version of your tightness might be. And then once you've found that, just holding this stretch on its own isn't enough. We need to get your brain and nervous system involved to activate this tissue so that it releases quickly. So once you've found a position that really isolates the spot that feels the most tight for you, try and squeeze everything. So keep the butt squeezed, try and tense up the thigh muscles, tense up the muscles at the front of the hip, even push your knee down forward into the ground just to really flare that tissue up. We want to hold this contract relax technique for about 5 to 10 seconds. And then when you relax that, you should find that you can actually go a little bit further into the stretch than what you could before. And the idea behind this is that that immediate and maximal tensing is then followed by a reflexive maximal relaxation. And it really cues your nervous system and your brain into releasing that tissue as quickly as possible. Now, if you find that this captures a lot of the tightness, but there's still some added sort of restriction there, you can grab one of those power bands or those exercise bands, wrap it around your hip, pulling it forwards in sort of a modified couch stretch. And that really helps bias the joint capsule, the deeper joint capsule, which again can be one of the main reasons why that pelvis is sort of dumping forwards when it should. Now again, if you're finding that this is a great stretch for you, but you want to take it up another notch, then what we can get you to do is we can actually do another sort of modified couch stretch where we bring your heel to your bottom, try and be up nice and tall. Obviously it helps to have something to hold on to, but by winding up this knee, we're capturing a lot more of the rec fem, that sort of quad that attaches to the front of the pelvis as well. We're sort of isolating it a little bit more, and then what you want to make sure that you do is being up nice and tall, keeping everything squeezed, push into that sort of hip flexion, or more into hip extension, opening up those hip flexors. And then once you've found a good position, then just squeeze everything. So tense up those glutes, push your foot back into your hand, go through this position for 5 to 10 seconds, let it relax, then see if you can go further into the stretch than what you could before, making sure that you're following where you feel you need to be to release that tightness. Give that a bit of a squeeze for a few seconds, and then relax. Now what you should find, hopefully, is that you've really loosened up the front of that hip quite substantially. And then again, coming back to your test and retest, make sure that you stand in the same position again, give your butt a bit of a squeeze, and then you'll hopefully feel that there's not as much translation backwards from that pelvis because you've taken away some of that restriction at the front of the hip. So that's the first exercise. So in my experience as a physio, loosening up the front of those hips, and again, it's not just hip flexors, it can be hip capsule, it can be other sort of soft tissue as well. But ungluing the front of those hips really gives that pelvis a chance to stop being pulled into an anteriorly tilted position and allows you to reorientate that and keep it there, which is what the next two exercises are going to go through. So for me, if you can free up the front of the hips, we then need to make sure that your body can sort of reassess where it is and then sort of get that muscle control back to hold that pelvis in a good position. And the next two exercises we're going to go through are strength-based exercises. They're not sort of intense strength exercises, but what they tend to do is they tend to try and hold that pelvis in a good position while you're doing the things that you're doing day to day. So the first exercise that we're going to go through is just a basic plank exercise. And the reason why this is really important is because it gives us a chance to reorientate the pelvis, hold it in a good position in context and a really functional movement. So what I want you to do here before we get to the plank is, again, give that butt cheek a bit of a squeeze, and then I want you to draw your belly in to try and maintain that shape so that when you let your glutes go, if you're maintaining a braced spine, it shouldn't feel like the pelvis has a tendency to want to drop down again. So again, a great way to do this to begin with is squeeze that butt cheek to put the pelvis in a good position. Draw your belly in, so really sort of brace that spine. So we're not squeezing, it's more of a drawing in feeling. It's not a sucking in feeling, it's just a drawing in feeling. It should be independent of your breathing. So if you're maintaining a good, stable spine, when you release those glutes, that pelvis shouldn't dump. And then what we want to do here is then to retrain that. We want to do this in the form of a plank. So again, this isn't a fancy exercise at all. Again, make sure that you've got your butt squeezed, draw that belly in, come into a plank, and then hold this for 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute, whatever you feel most comfortable doing. Do sets of 30 seconds if you want to. But the important thing is that if you get to a point where you get to say 10 or 15 seconds and you feel like you're starting to sink or starting to dump, or you lose that gluteal activation, stop, take a break, and then come back to it. Because we want to make sure that we do some quality here. We want to make sure that your pelvis is aligned correctly, your belly's braced, your butt's squeezed. You want to hold that position, hold on for dear life. As soon as you feel like it starts to wane or starts to peter out, have a break, come back to it. We really want to focus on that quality. So again, we're trying to retrain your trunk stabilizers to maintain that pelvic position, so when your butt isn't squeezed, that pelvis is still orientated in a great way. So that's exercise number 2. The third exercise is more so coming at it from underneath. We want to give you some functional glute strength again to make sure that pelvis has the best chance of being orientated correctly. And for me, what I really like with this is we know that when you squeeze your butt, so when you squeeze those butt cheeks, that pelvis orientates really well. So what I want you to do is we're going to do that in the form of a squat. So the way that I think is really good to do this is if you stand up nice and tall, instead of just squeezing your butt cheeks, what I'll get you to do is try and rotate your knees outwards. So if you squeeze your butt, rotate your knees out, you should feel the muscles in your hips will start to activate. And then we can put that into a basic squat movement. And what you should hopefully see is if you've got your feet straight, your knees rotated out, your butt squeezed, when you squat down, your knees will track outside of your feet without your feet and toes coming off the ground. This is a great way to reorientate your pelvis and to keep your glutes functioning in a way that holds your pelvis in a good position. So again, we want to make sure that you've got your butt squeezed, your core switched on, knees rotated out. We're going to go through a few sets and a few reps to make sure that we retrain and fatigue those glutes in a functional shape that we want. So to recap those exercises, we need to make sure that we unglue the front of the hip to give the pelvis a chance to reorientate. Excuse me. And we want to make sure we do some core strength and some glute strength exercises to retrain the pelvis so your brain and nervous system understands that's where you want it to be. So I don't know why I'm puffing, didn't do much, but the important thing about this is fixing an anteriorly tilted pelvis goes beyond just the pelvis. We need to look at how you sit and how often you sit. We need to unglue some tightness, retrain some relative weakness or some instability there, depending on who you are and what you're going through. So going forward, we need to make sure that you fix those things so that it doesn't come back in the future. So if you went on to enjoy the video, please consider leaving a like down below. Let me know in the comments any of those little tidbits that you may have that I can pick up on. And then if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe to the channel. If you enjoy what's going on, please join with me. We're hoping to turn this into something pretty fantastic. So with that being said, I'll stop trying to puff. We'll see you in the next one.